first webinar in our new spring series where we'll be discussing natural disasters, severe weather, and how situational awareness can better help businesses prepare for these different phenomena. We'll also be discussing additional challenges related to COVID-19 and the link between climate change and increasing severe weather across the globe. My name is Josephine Nett, and I'm an intelligence analyst here at Swan Island. Joining me today is Ariel Goldfarb, our senior intelligence analyst, as well as Miranda Euros, our director of intelligence and operations. So today is going to be our introductory webinar to give you an idea about what we'll be discussing in this spring series. We'll start off by talking about severe weather and natural disaster events and their connection to climate change, before getting into some of the downstream effects and negative impacts related to the increase in and intensification of natural disasters and severe weather. We'll then give you a bit of a glimpse of how COVID-19 and the lasting impacts of the pandemic are going to further complicate preparing and responding to these crises. We'll finish up by discussing why situational awareness is key to staying ahead of these unprecedented storm seasons and disaster events. And we'll also share a few predictions for the outlook in 2021. Also, stick around to the end of our presentation to hear the dates for the rest of the webinars in our series. And we'll also be doing a short Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, feel free to submit them through the chat throughout the presentation. Now, before we get into the link between climate change and severe weather, or the impacts they might have, let's first address what kinds of meteorological, climatological, hydrological, and geophysical events are actually considered when we talk about this topic. So some examples would be tropical storms, including hurricanes and cyclones, wildfires and landslides, derechos, winter storms and cold snaps, severe thunderstorms and tornadoes, torrential rain, flooding, heat waves and drought, earthquakes and tsunamis, as well as volcanoes. Now that we know what events we're going to be looking at, let's actually get into the link between severe weather and climate change. Now, as you can see from this graphic, record-breaking really has become our new normal when it comes to both climate change and severe weather. In fact, 19 of the 20 warmest years in recorded history were in the period between 2002 and 2020. Also, as shown by this graph, the number of natural disasters registering losses has been steadily increasing since 1980, with a large increase seen just in the last 10 years. Now, according to a report released by the Environmental Protection Agency, this rise in extreme weather events fits a pattern you can expect with a warming planet. And scientists project that climate change will actually make some of these extreme weather events more likely to occur and or more likely to be severe. According to a report released by the United Nations, there's been a staggering rise in the number of extreme weather events over the past 20 years, driven largely by rising global temperatures and other climatic changes. Now, before moving on to some specific numbers and some links to specific severe weather types, let's first take a look at a compilation of studies that was done in the field of extreme event attribution, which looks to investigate which causes are driving extreme weather events. So this study that was done and recently updated in 2021 actually mapped major severe weather events globally. The majority of these events happened after 2011. Now, researchers for this study found that 63% of all extreme weather events studied to date were made more likely and or more severe by climate change. They also found that climate change especially raises the risk of extreme weather types that are linked to heat. As you can see, there were also some severe weather events that are not directly connected to climate change. But that being said, let's now get into some specifics. So in the table below, you can see that in the left column, there are some widely accepted effects of climate change. And according to studies done by the EPA, the right column indicates the severe weather type that's impacted by that climate change effect. And in this case, impact just means that the severe weather event is increasing in either frequency or intensity or both. Now, as you can see, rising air and ocean temperatures have some degree of impact on the frequency and intensity of severe thunderstorms, tornadoes, and hurricanes. Actually, according to NOAA's annual climate report, the average rate of increase in combined land and ocean temperature between 1981 and 2020 has been more than twice that of the rate of increase between 1880 and 1980. And moving on a little bit, dry conditions and earlier snowmelts are resulting in a longer and more intense wildfire season. The warming atmosphere and warming Arctic are helping to increase the severity of winter storms. And rising sea levels are contributing to an increase in the frequency and intensity of coastal flooding. In fact, in terms of increasing sea levels, in the last 150 years, the global sea level has increased a full 8 inches. Now, as we can see, climate change is clearly fueling more frequent, more intense disasters in some way. According to United Nations report, there has been an 83% increase in climate-related disasters, a 40% increase in severe storms, a twofold increase in floods, and significant increases in droughts, wildfires, and heat waves, all in the last 20 years. Now that we have an idea of the connection between climate change and severe weather, let's look up to the next graphic to see how strong these connections really are. So on the diagram above, we can see a rough estimate of the strength of the link between climate change and severe weather in terms of specific disaster types. So the strongest evidence of a link exists for heat waves, wildfires, and coastal flooding. Scientists also report fairly strong evidence of a link for severe thunderstorms and extreme precipitation. Finally, weaker evidence still suggests some link between climate change and an increase in earthquakes, volcanic activity, hurricanes, and tornadoes. Now, for each webinar in our series, we're going to be going into further detail about each of these specific severe weather event types. But for now, I'm going to hand it over to Ariel, who will walk us through some of the implications of this increase in severe weather and natural disasters.
All right, we will discuss some of these downstream effects that severe weather may have. It's easy to feel that, severe weather season won't directly impact your business if it's in something that in previous years may not have occurred. But in fact, these impacts of severe weather may be more far-reaching than you think. Aside from the loss of life and the injury, as well as the immediate impacts that you can anticipate with a severe weather event, there are other indirect and long-term effects that are critical to take into consideration. These include the tremendous economic costs associated with the damage, as well as the pause of business, the cleanup and recovery efforts required in the aftermath of the system, the prolonged power outages that prevent a quick resumption of business activities, and the secondary geophysical and hydrological impacts that may be experienced, such as flooding, landslides, and mudslides. As you can see from this diagram, these are all very interconnected as downstream effects of the overarching storm systems. Taking a closer look at some of the downstream impacts that we just mentioned, damage is an obvious direct effect of these events. Each year, NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, considers various categories in its assessment of the damage caused by severe weather. These categories include physical damage to residential, commercial, and governmental buildings, the material assets that are found within those buildings and the damage to that, the time lost due to business interruption in the aftermath of these storms, the damage to vehicles, boats, and other modes of transportation, damage to any offshore energy platforms, public infrastructure damage to roads and bridges, the loss of any agricultural assets such as crops and livestock, and the cost of the disaster restoration, as well as the disaster suppression costs in events such as wildfires and others. So taking these damage categories into consideration, it becomes possible to provide an overarching estimate of the economic cost that's associated with severe weather. While many of these events cost millions, there are disasters every year that result in over $1 billion in damage and costs. So what does that actually mean for us? Since the 1980s, NOAA has been tracking these billion-dollar disasters. And the average until about 2015 really stood at about 7 per year. But 2020 was really record-breaking, with the most billion-dollar disasters on record, with 22 individual billion-dollar disaster events in 2020 alone. While this may seem like a threat that impacts only a subset of states, 50 states since 1980 have had at least $1 billion disaster. And this highlights the magnitude of this threat and its impact across the entire country. Looking at that a little bit more closely and where these $20 billion disasters struck, you can see that majority were clustered around central and southeastern United States. However, that doesn't mean that states not impacted last year are immune from the threat. And with an increasing number of these severe events taking place each year and a continuation of this prediction for the upcoming year, we can assume that more states are going to be impacted each year. Not only are the frequency of these expensive yearly events rising, but the cost itself is rising as well, which highlights the need for new levels and methods of preparedness and response to mitigate these costs. The billion-dollar disaster events in 2020 alone totaled $95 billion in damage, and that doesn't account for the sub-billion-dollar disasters that occurred. The costliest event of the year included Hurricane Laura, costing $19 billion, the Western US wildfire, with estimates coming in at $16.5 billion, and the August Midwest derecho, which cost about $11 billion. It's still too soon to tell what 2020 will bring, but the Texas winter storms in February provide us with some idea of what we can expect, with an estimated damage of over $125 billion already. So with this increase in the number of severe storms comes an increase in downstream impacts that we discussed a couple slides back, and with that, an increase in power outages across the country. The aging US power grid is primarily above ground right now, which makes it extremely susceptible to severe weather of all kinds. Climate Central, which is a nonprofit that analyzes and reports on climate science data, analyzed 20 years of power outage information supplied by utilities companies and federal government agencies. The data from that time frame highlighted a marked 67% increase in what they term major power outages, which are those that impact over 50,000 people. This increase is in this decade alone when compared to the early 2000s. Over 34 states and Washington, D.C. have experienced an increase in these major power outages from weather events alone. And Michigan is actually leading the way with 111 major weather-related outages, and Texas not far behind with 105. And this doesn't even take into account the February storms that we just mentioned, with some estimates saying, that the damage has already amounted to over $125 billion in Texas. If these predictions of an increasingly active severe weather season and the possibility of major outages is not enough, things of course have remained a little bit more complicated with COVID and the COVID-19 pandemic this year. So the COVID-19 crisis has further complicated this already very complex severe weather picture. With workers and businesses going remote, the challenge of safeguarding individuals across a decentralized set of locations has increased, and power outages and damage has the potential to impact more individuals with fewer centralized solutions. The impacts don't stop there when we see the impacts on the healthcare system during natural disasters as being just as significant, with hospitals that are already full with COVID-19 patients now required to also care for an influx of patients following severe weather events. In addition to that, we know that wildfire smoke has a direct impact on the pulmonary system, making people who are already susceptible and maybe at higher risk for COVID-19 even more vulnerable during wildfire season. But perhaps most challenging when considering the overlap between COVID-19 and severe weather stems around the mixed messaging surrounding evacuations and social distancing, with calls for evacuations during natural disasters and a simultaneous call for social distancing by officials. And while there is this general sense that we're in a stage of COVID-19 recovery with the vaccine rollout and with the reopening plans beginning, we're not fully out of the woods yet. And there are still implications of the crossover of severe weather and COVID-19 that are important to consider. Humanitarian organizations are continuing to struggle with a lack of funding and with a shortage of available volunteers. And furthermore, the mass evacuation sites and shelters that are usually used by states to house evacuees have been converted into vaccination centers. In the face of these natural disasters, the vaccination process and COVID-19 recovery progress would inevitably be put on hold and potentially even reversed slightly. So what is really the why we're doing all of this, and what is its impact for us? A better understanding of the underlying causes of extreme weather events gives society a powerful tool for anticipating risks and making informed decisions. And with this in mind, it's important for us to understand what we can each do to safeguard our businesses in the face of these threats. With that, I'll pass the baton on to my colleague Miranda, who will walk us through that next portion of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Ariel and Josie. And as much as we'd like to put a year like 2020 behind us, we can all see that these threats just continue to rise. And regardless of climate change's influence, natural disasters and severe weather are inevitable and largely beyond our control. And so to be more proactive in the face of the worsening disaster seasons and to adjust to new conditions brought about by the pandemic, businesses have to seriously invest in preparedness and resilience boosting tools and technology that provide valuable, actionable information at the right time while still making good economic sense. And that's where situational awareness, of course, comes in, a means to anticipate, prepare, mobilize, respond, and eventually evaluate risks in order to mitigate or avoid the impacts altogether, such as costs that might include shutdowns, fines, losses, damaged inventory, lost productivity, and even, unfortunately, loss of life. And by improving risk resilience, organizations can take on more risk, which might allow them to operate in new markets or take market share away from competitors that are less prepared for managing these operational risks. Our enterprise software platform, TX360, is a really manageable tool that business continuity and security teams can integrate into their daily workflows for threat monitoring and situational awareness, with the ability to scale up or surge as needed in the face of increased threats like the natural disasters we've been talking about. It's highly customizable to the finest detail of your security operations. It pulls in intelligence from thousands of sources across social media, news, and official outlets. And it provides hyperlocal monitoring, sometimes down to the street level, and supports hundreds of assets and users. And throughout this series, we'll show you case studies and real-time examples of how the team here at Swan Island Networks supports clients before, during, and after natural disaster crises with our dashboards, alerting, and other services. As for 2021, it is still too early to predict everything that's going to come out from this year, especially those rapid weather developments. But there are some warming and drying trends and high temperatures going on into spring. You can see in this upper left graphic that could really spell concern for this year's wildfires, especially in places with below average snowpack. Increasingly above temperatures are forecast across the US deeper into spring and possibly summer, especially in the western US and the central region in that purple zone there. Thanks to ongoing dry drought conditions in the west, as well as possible lingering effects of La Nina in that ENSO cycle and forecasts from computer model guidance. And the official start to the Atlantic hurricane season might be June 1st, but in recent years, we've seen named storms common in May and even as early as April. And AccuWeather's team of tropical weather experts predicts an above average Atlantic hurricane season this year, most likely to result in 16 to 20 named storms, including 7 to 10 hurricanes. And of those storms projected to reach hurricane strength, 3 to 5 are predicted to become major hurricanes, which means a category 3 or higher. And as we take a closer look at extreme weather in our series, we're going to continue to share the latest predictions and forecasts as those things become clearer through time. As to our webinar series, here is the planned lineup for this spring heading into summer. So be sure to follow our emails or our social media posts, or even reach out to us directly if you're interested in registering. And in addition to great information and preparedness resources, we will be announcing some exciting offers as well, so don't miss out. Thank you so much for attending our very first kickoff webinar here. We're really excited for this series, and now I'd like to hand it back to Josie and see if we've had any questions come in during this presentation.
Thanks, Miranda. Yeah, we actually have had a couple questions coming in. So the first one is, can you tell me a bit about your experience monitoring severe weather and those threats? And also, where does that information and sourcing come from?
Yeah, I can certainly answer that. So we have a lot of experience. In just the past few years, we've stood up dashboards for basically every major wildfire, hurricane, earthquakes, and other disasters, especially in the United States, along with, of course, all of the alerting that we do on the developments before and during these crises. And then TX360's dashboards and smart alerts not only rely on this internal team of analysts alerting, but also thousands of automated channels in the system. So official organizations like NOAA, CAL FIRE, National Weather Service, in addition to the local, state, and federal officials and news outlets that publish updates to social media and those official feeds 24/7. And those updates can be automatically filtered and distributed at all hours, which is obviously critical for a lot of these events where those developments happen so quickly and often overnight and across different time zones.
Great, thank you. So our next question is, does severe weather impact businesses of all sizes equally? And do I really need to worry as a small business owner?
I think that's a great question, and I'd be happy to answer that one. You know, I
Go
think
for it.
I think the one thing that we kind of know for sure about this severe weather is how unpredictable it can be. And we have seen an increase in the number and magnitudes of these events as the years have gone by, which really means that their impacts are also becoming more and more widespread, and nobody is really considered safe in that way. If we look, even at a year like this one, it is true that larger businesses may face a greater number of challenges in the face of severe weather, including, the challenge of safeguarding many personnel that are very decentralized, as well as a number of assets that are larger, whereas smaller businesses may have fewer locations to worry about. But with that being said, the size of the business does not provide any sort of immunity or a guarantee even that severe weather won't impact you. And often small businesses do feel that the impacts and burdens of severe weather are greater than a larger company that may have an easier time absorbing the cost associated with this event. And so with that, I would say, everybody sort of has something to really be looking to in the coming year and really worrying about these upcoming severe weather threats, whether small or large.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ariel. Our final question is, I live in Western United States and my primary business concern surrounds wildfires. Is there value in attending the other sessions dealing with other severe weather types?
Yeah, I can speak to that. So thank you for the question. Obviously, every business has a different footprint and structure, so it's true that something like hurricanes and the impacts with those might feel very distant for somebody in the Western United States. I know we feel that way up in Portland. But still, I'm of the mind that these disasters have a lot of common threads, and there's going to be things in the hurricane webinar that can be translated for wildfire preparedness. But the nice thing about this webinar series is that you can tune in for any of these topics for a really focused, in-depth look on a hazard by hazard basis if you prefer to approach things in that way. But I would also add that being located out west, there's going to be very relevant information in our earthquakes webinar as well. So good reason to still mark multiple episodes on your calendar.
All right, thank you so much, Miranda. That's it for our questions.
Sweet. Well, thank you again, ladies, for joining us today, and to everybody who attended the webinar. We're really excited to kick off this series. So again, I'll pop that schedule on the screen for you guys. So please feel free to join us, and thank you.